Just recently, we published a video briefly documenting Intel's rise to the top and how AMD's Ryzen is finally knocking them down a few hundred pegs. But during our research for that video, we were reminded of just how badly Intel actually deserves this Ryzen branded kick in the shins, and maybe a whole lot worse. We decided not to include a lot of this in the previous history of Intel video because it's so deep that it required its own look. The company has a colorful history of pulling some seriously shady anti-everything except their bottom line tricks in order to come out on top, and those are what we'll be gandering at in this video. And before anybody starts calling us AMD shills, we will be covering AMD's incompetence in a later video. So now we'll mainly be taking a broader look at the whole story rather than focusing on the nitty-gritty details. So, where to start? Well, where better than the time Intel asked AMD for help and then kicked it to the curb. Got broken contracts and sleight of hand. Back in the early 80s, when IBM and women's shoulder pads were still relevant, the company decided to power its machines with Intel's processors. But because they didn't want to solely rely on Intel to supply all of said chips, IBM told Intel to make friends and bring on another supplier. That supplier turned out to be AMD, and so an agreement was born, or more specifically, a technology exchange agreement that let AMD manufacture Intel developed processors in exchange for royalties, and the other way around, of course. The agreement was intended to last up to 10 years and officially took effect in 1982. Well, as is often the case with these kinds of arrangements, things didn't go exactly as planned. So 2 years after the agreement went into effect, Intel decided that they didn't want AMD to have access to its tech anymore and refused to give the company details about their 80386 chip, also known as the i386, or just 386 instead of 8386. Anyways, obviously, AMD wasn't happy about that and finally spoke out years later, invoking arbitration, after which Intel went, quote, "Well, screw you guys then," and canceled the agreement entirely. All of that spiraled into a legal battle which spanned many years, concluding with AMD eventually winning the argument, and they all lived happily ever after. Wait, no, that's not what happened at all. No, Intel appealed AMD's victory, which led to yet another lengthy legal battle. Some light appeared at the end of the tunnel for AMD when in 1994, even the Supreme Court of California found AMD to be in the right, because obviously. And while all of that was going on, Intel also filed a copyright lawsuit against AMD in 1990, claiming that AMD used some of Intel's microcode in its processors. 2 years later, a jury agreed that AMD wasn't allowed to do that. Only just a year later, though, Intel was found guilty of discovery abuse and another trial got underway. A trial which concluded that actually AMD totally had the right to use Intel's microcode in its processors. Go figure. These legal battles, even though they ended with AMD walking out victorious, probably worked out exactly as Intel had hoped. Wait, what? I hear you ask? How is losing a lawsuit a good thing for Intel? Well, see, lengthy legal battles actually proved to be a remarkably effective, if shady as heck, business tactic. While AMD was fighting for the rights and access to the tech that they were kind of entitled to, losing but tons of money in legal fees in the process, Intel was raking in the cash and market share. AMD was being severely hampered from producing processors at every point, all while Intel gained its monopoly. We could probably draw a few parallels between this and, the DRAM manufacturers' antitrust stuff going on right now. Just potentially, maybe, a little bit, who knows. So by the time any of the lawsuits played out in AMD's favor, it was already too late. Intel had already won where it mattered, because let me remind you that things that are payable by fine are only illegal for poor companies. And so while these legal tactics were pretty dang shady, they don't even come close to the shadiest crap Intel has pulled over the years, which brings us to our next point. Money beats performance. So sometime later, after many of the lawsuits the two companies had been handing out to each other like candy, they came to an end via monumental settlement, and AMD got back on the horse. And not just any horse, the K5 horse, my friends, also known as AMD's first in-house horse. that was a bad metaphor. These new K5 processors, along with the K6 and K7 products that succeeded them, proved to be pretty dang impressive, few more so than AMD's Athlon processors. The Athlon CPUs were absolute powerhouses, making short work of pretty much everything Intel had on store shelves at the time. The Athlon dominance continued for a while, but not content with only stealing Intel's desktop performance crown, AMD also released their server-focused Opteron platform a few years down the road, beating out Intel's offerings yet again. But contrary to what you would expect from a company clearly producing superior products, AMD didn't gain a proportionate market share increase. The company did gain a larger share in both the desktop and server markets during the Athlon and Opteron days, but considering just how much better these processor lines were compared to Intel's, it was still actually pretty low. So why was that? Well, if the many lawsuits and investigations aimed at Intel were any indication, the reason AMD, or anyone else for that matter, couldn't really amass a much larger market share was because Intel was throwing its bulbous monopolizing weight around. See, in the 2000s, AMD started filing claims against Intel like it was the early 90s. One of the largest of these claims was made in Japan. In it, AMD claimed there was something fishy going on between Intel and major PC manufacturers like Sony, Toshiba, Fujitsu, NEC, and Hitachi. After some time spent investigating the matter, the Japanese Federal Trade Commission found the source of the smell. As it turns out, Intel was stuffing salmon down its pants. No, that's not right. No, sorry. They had deals in place with these manufacturers promising to reward them with cash payments, rebates, subsidies, allowances, and other financial and non-financial benefits, and all they had to do, the manufacturers, was promise not to use AMD's superior processors in their products. That's right, folks. Intel literally paid manufacturers to avoid AMD like the plague. The same thing was also happening in the US to a much larger degree. AMD claimed again that Intel had been paying off manufacturers and retailers in a quote pervasive global scheme to coerce Intel customers from freely dealing with AMD to the detriment of customers and consumers worldwide. AMD's German arm also filed a claim against Intel, calling them out for pulling the same crap with one of the country's biggest PC retailers, MediaMarkt. After another round of investigations, the European Commission found Intel and MediaMarkt guilty of breaking antitrust laws. The European Commission also fined Intel $1.45 billion, stating that the company harmed millions of European consumers and went to great lengths to cover up its anti-competitive actions. And no, they didn't fine them in dollars because it was in a European car. I like to convert to the correct currency. Another fine was sent Intel's way in South Korea, where the country's antitrust regulator found Intel to be in violation of fair trade rules by giving South Korean companies like Samsung rebate for not using AMD processors. The fine totaled about $25.4 million. So around 2009, AMD and Intel again agreed to settle all of the ongoing litigation between the two, with Intel agreeing to pay AMD $1.25 billion and maybe also promising to maybe start playing nice. Intel's global campaign to strong-arm companies into shunning AMD's products was dang near dastardly. In many cases, AMD's chips handedly outperformed Intel's while also coming in at a cheaper price tag. But because of Intel's tactics, consumers had severely limited access to them. And even if retailers and manufacturers wanted to and would benefit heavily from including AMD CPUs in their systems, some of them were so reliant on Intel's rewards, that they couldn't afford to take them. Heck, Intel had such a stranglehold over some manufacturers like HP that the company was persuaded to refuse an offer from AMD consisting of 1 million free processors. They couldn't afford to take free processors from AMD. Intel, of course, settled, denied, disputed, complied, and did whatever they could to save face throughout the whole thing. And even though they faced some hefty fines and paid other companies billions of dollars, they didn't seem all that phased. They had gained and maintained their gigantic market shares and helped to ensure that it would take AMD almost another decade to become relevant in the CPU market again, because fines make things only illegal for poor companies. But wait, there's more! Yeah, so far we've only really focused on the most memorable, almost evil, genius level poopy head moves Intel has made to get ahead over the years, and I say poopy head in the most endearing way possible. But they're certainly not the only ones. We can't really give all of them the attention that they probably deserve, but here's sort of a anti-highlight reel of some of Intel's other offenses. So around the same time that Intel and AMD agreed to stop suing each other so much, the US Federal Trade Commission was readying another suit against Intel. The suit, like many of the ones we've already discussed, centered around Intel and their deliberate campaign to hamstring competitive threats to its monopoly. What makes this lawsuit one of the more interesting ones we've talked about is that it details a few other not so sportsman-like practices it believed Intel had participated in, including secretly redesigning key software that would make Intel's chips seem faster in certain benchmarks than AMD's chips, even though they totally worked. That's right, because of the way Intel redesigned their compiler software, it seemed as though the company's processors were faster, even though the hardware itself definitely wasn't. It's basically like your GPU saying it's getting 108 FPS when it's only running 90. On a totally unrelated topic, Intel actually admitted to fudging Pentium 4 benchmarks in 2014 and agreed to pay certain former Pentium 4 owners $15. Class action lawsuits, my friends. Another interesting part that was sort of tacked on to the FTC's lawsuit against Intel was a mention of NVIDIA. The FTC believed that Intel might aim to preserve its CPU monopoly by smothering potential competition from GPU chips such as those made by NVIDIA, and that there is a dangerous probability that Intel's unfair methods of competition could allow it to extend its monopoly into the cheap GPU chip markets. This lawsuit and NVIDIA's own legal battle against Intel was primarily aimed at ensuring that Intel couldn't block third-party GPUs from working with their platforms, as they sort of attempted to with their Nehalem architecture, as AnandTech explains. It basically would shut down the PCI Express lane. Intel and NVIDIA went on to settle the legal issues between them, with NVIDIA walking away with $1.5 billion in compensation. If you're wondering why the green team's so big, that might have a lot to do with it. What Intel couldn't achieve with lawsuits or bags of money, they often tried to do was straight bad-mouthing. In a response to AMD's lawsuit about Intel paying off OEMs to not use AMD products, Intel claimed that it was actually all AMD's fault for, quote, playing it safe with anemic investment in manufacturing capacity, leaving Intel to shoulder the burden of investment to enhance the usefulness of computers and enhance the market. End quote. That's basically Intel saying, hey AMD, you suck, and if you didn't suck so much, maybe you wouldn't have these problems. Intel added that AMD is dogged by its reputation for unreliability as a supplier, and that the company lagged in innovation, and that AMD regularly fails to hit launch dates, showing its unreliability. I wonder if we've ever seen a paper launch from a company in blue. If some of that sounds familiar, it could be because Intel had actually said similar things when discussing AMD's EPYC server chips. As you'll remember, Intel snarkily called the chips glued together desktop dies, but also couldn't help but proclaim that AMD has a poor track record, is an inconsistent supplier, and lacks an ecosystem. Oh, and then PS, something we totally forgot to mention when we first did this video, let's not forget how Intel's CEO Brian Krzanich, former CEO since he resigned just a few days ago, he sold all of his stocks that he could right after Intel was informed of the meltdown and Spectre flaws, but before the public had knowledge of it. Of course, Intel claimed that the sale was totally unrelated to the discovery of the flaws, but come on. Intel claimed that the sale was actually scheduled to go down anyway, but the thing is, it was only scheduled to go through around 5 months after the company was told about the flaws. Isn't that interesting? Now, as we've already said, these examples only scratch the surface of Intel's laundry list of shady business practices and vindictive monopolizing tactics of snuffing out their competition, and in the process slowed down progress in innovation. If you want to dig deeper, you'll find even more examples and a lot of other interesting details. That being said, the purpose of this video isn't to shame Intel or anything like that. We just kind of hope it serves as a reminder that these big companies have a ton of power at their disposal, and if you think they won't use it to get their way, you're kidding yourself. And none of this is to say don't buy Intel or go ahead and buy Ryzen. That is not the point of this video whatsoever. We're not trying to shill for one company or another. We're simply trying to bring all of the information to the table and hopefully at mildly entertaining fashion so that you guys can be informed about the decisions that you're making when you're supporting one or the other companies. Things we don't mention when we talk about Intel is how now their CPUs are conflict free, which is a huge achievement by them. And potentially we should do a video in the future about Intel's major successes. That would be a video that I think would be fair in compensation for doing this one and the last one, because crapping on Intel all the time, while it's a fun adventure because it's the talk of the town these days, it's not necessarily fair to all of the things that they've accomplished as a company. But also, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we're not just going to be crapping on Intel. We plan to keep going with this history of series, and we'll be talking about AMD's incompetence as well, because they're not totally scot-free of all of the crap that has gone on in the CPU market. And then we can deal with GPUs later. Anyways, let me know what you guys think of this series, the history of series. We definitely think that the first one hit a good mark, and we would like to keep going with them. So your like button down below, your comments of support or discussion would mean the world to us. And if we messed anything up, let us know. We're totally okay with that. We tried to do the best research that we could, putting it in here, but at the same time, things get missed, and there's explanations that explain things that we assumed and other people assumed. And we all view life through a filtered lens that complicates everything. We have our own worldview, and that makes things difficult. But we here at UFD Tech are definitely open to making sure that we question our worldview, we question our assumptions, and that we can continue forward and we can take the L on being wrong on certain topics. Anyways, that's gonna wrap it up here. I'm Brett with the UFD Tech channel. Thank you so much for watching. Please get subscribed to stay up to date on all of our tech-related content, and I'll see your smiling faces again later. Cheers.